Hey Optimancers, Chris here. Before we start, I just wanted to give a shout out to a Kickstarter I recently backed. The Vagabond role-playing system is currently in development, but a PDF preview is available on the Kickstarter page. And if you like 5th edition, and I know a lot of my viewers do, there will be a fair amount of things that are familiar, but with a more streamlined combat and intuitive spellcasting system. There's also already a lot of unique character options, like you can play your standard human, dwarf, elf. You can play a rogue, a fighter, or a wizard, but you can also play like a mimic gunslinger or a harpy pugilist. I really want to see the final game get developed, which will require that the Kickstarter get funded, so I wanted to make my viewers aware of the project, and if you like, I've pinned a link in the Kickstarter in the comments, so I encourage you to check it out for yourselves. I am ranking every racial option in D&D on this tier chart from A to D. There's no F tier because, in my view, you can make an effective character with any race in the game, and even the lower ranked races are occasionally optimal in the right build. In my last video, I ranked all the Player's Handbook races. Here's where they landed. As you can see, the Player's Handbook races landed primarily near the bottom, and the notable exception, unsurprisingly, is the Variant Human, which ranks S tier. The method I'm using involves assigning a point score for each racial feature, and then I add them up. This includes features such as ability score bonuses if they don't follow the standard +3, or movement rates if they don't follow the standard 30 feet. This means negative scores are possible for speeds or ability bonuses that fall beneath these standards. If the racial option point total is 49 points or lower, then it's going to rank D tier. 50 to 62 gets you in C tier. 64 and 72 gets them in B tier, so middle of the road. Then 73 to 92 for an A tier ranking, and higher than that for an S tier ranking. I decided on these totals after I did all the point totals for races so that when all is said and done, we're going to have a pretty even distribution between the tiers. Assigning a point total to a racial feature is very subjective, and I do not expect that you will agree with all the decisions I made. However, if you want to understand my thought process for assigning points, I went through it in an introductory video, which I'm linking at the top of the screen, that you can check out. You'll find that a lot of the points I'm assigning in this video have been predetermined, so I'm following the same guidelines for every racial option through several videos. But here's a very brief rundown. A racial feature that's more of a ribbon feature gets anywhere from 1 to 9 points. A more minor feature but substantial gets 10 to 20 points. 21 to 40 for a pretty potent feature. 41 to 60 for a very potent feature, 61 to 80 for a very powerful feature, and 81 to 100 for those extremely powerful features. And in my opinion, the most optimal feature of all, a free feat, gets the race 125 points. I've also given a more thorough rundown in the video description if you like. Today I'm covering Monsters of the Multiverse, but there are 33 options in that book, so that necessitates I split the book into 2 videos. In my Player's Handbook tier video, I covered the racial options from lowest scoring to highest, but I'm doing alphabetical for these videos, so today I'm covering A to G and in just alphabetical order, and then in my next video from H onwards. Is that all clear as mud? Great. Now it's important to remember that having a DM be receptive to your good ideas is key to a good experience at the table. And so I've done some extensive research and determined the best way to achieve that is to show them you're a patron of this channel. Now, if you're skeptical, I'll remind you there is no way to disprove what I just claimed. The following folks know this firsthand as they all clicked the link in the video description and became Archmage level supporters. Aaron Kaler, Adam Langley, Rob Reichelt, Awesomeface, Benjamin, Brett McDowell, Dash Panther, Dave Peters, David Lotz, David W. Skibbins, Gakumaru, Ian Johnson, James Thomas, Jad Zan, John Cripps, Jonathan Haynes, Jonathan Lexi, K.J. Aurelio, Kevin Casey, Kurt G., Kavothe, Marlon Rooks, Nathaniel McCauley, Nick Simmons, Rizquai, Sad Keone 7, Stephen Edmondson, and TUM. And an additional thank you to all my patrons. Let's get started. And we begin with the Aarakocra, and I'm sure it will come as no surprise that the Aarakocra is going to do well. So they get Flight. This has the minor limitation of not being able to wear heavy armor, but it's honestly not that big a deal. This is unlimited duration, non-concentration flight, which is, without question, one of the most powerful racial features, period. This gets the Aarakocra 100 points. Next up is Talons. This allows the Aarakocra to make unarmed strikes that deal a d6 plus strength slashing damage. Now I presume by Talons they're talking about feet, meaning the Aarakocra can still make these attacks even if they have their hands occupied, so this is worth 10 points. And finally, the Aarakocra gets Wind Caller, allowing them to cast Gust of Wind at 3rd level and higher. They can pick their casting ability modifier and use spell slots to cast Gust of Wind again after their free casting. Gust of Wind isn't a really powerful 2nd level spell, but it's not terrible either. I gave it 20 points. So 100 plus 10 plus 20, and the Aarakocra scores a very high 130 points total. This doesn't just put them in S tier, it puts them high in S tier. The highest ranking race in the game is going to have 135 points, and we'll happen to be covering that race in this video as well. So from strength to strength, we will go from the Aarakocra to the potent Aasimar. When players talk about the strength of the Aasimar, they tend to talk about Celestial Revelation, but we shouldn't discount Celestial Resistance, which provides a rare case of a race getting 2 different damage resistances. Necrotic resistance is the resistance that I consider to be the most powerful one that any race gets in the game. Unlike most resistances, you can't replicate it with Absorb Elements or Protection from Poison spell, and necrotic damage is a fairly common damage type to face. This is worth 20 points, but the Aasimar also gets Radiant Damage Resistance, which is also hard to replicate, by the way, but as a player character, we tend to face Radiant Damage much less commonly, so it gets half the value at 10 points. So we add them together, and Celestial Resistance scores us a solid 30 points. Next up, we have Darkvision, which is a very standard feature, but it's consequential. Darkvision scores 10 points. Next up is Healing Hands. With an action, the Aasimar can heal hit points totaling a number of d4s equal to their proficiency bonus once per long rest. This isn't an overly powerful feature, but I figure it ends up being about as good as a 1st level Cure Wounds spell, which is middle of the road at 1st level. I mean, this is less powerful at lower levels than Cure Wounds, but more powerful at higher levels. I assigned it 10 points. Next up is Light Bearer, which gives the Aasimar the Light Cantrip. The Light Cantrip isn't super powerful, but it's okay. Cantrips score between 1 and 10, and I figure this is right about the middle, so I gave it 5 points. Of course, the big feature on the Aasimar is Celestial Revelation. It's probably the premier feature for any Aasimar. You can use it as a bonus action once per long rest, and it lasts for 1 minute. You can choose one of 3 options, and usually you're going to want to pick Radiant Soul. This is going to give you concentration-free flight for the duration, and you'll be able to add radiant damage equal to your proficiency bonus to 1 target you damage on each of your turns. Bonus action flight on its own, I value at 50 points, but I add another 20 for the damage bonus for a total of 70 points for Celestial Revelation. So we'll have 30 plus 10 plus 10 plus 5 plus 70, and the Aasimar total is 125. This will land them in the S tier, just to the right of the Aarakocra, and just to let you know, the more powerful the race is, the further to the left I put it on the tier. Let's move on to the Genasi. So we begin with movement rate, and I had actually forgotten about this until I started doing this tier chart exercise, but the Genasi has an enhanced movement rate of 35 feet, and I value this at 20 points. Then we have Darkvision. As we already established, this is worth 10 points. Unending Breath allows the Genasi to hold their breath indefinitely. However, it has a limitation that they can't hold their breath while they're incapacitated, which means, like, if you're in a situation, like you're underwater, that's a definite vulnerability. So it ranks just a hair lower than not needing to breathe at all, which would have been worth 10 points, so I gave this 8 points. Lightning Resistance is a middle-of-the-road resistance, and it scores 15 points. And then we have Mingle with the Wind, which provides a cantrip, a 1st level spell at 3rd level, and eventually a 2nd level spell. You can pick your casting ability score and use spell slots to cast these spells as well. That's true of all the spells like this in this book. Shocking Grasp is among the weaker cantrips, but it's not terrible. I gave it 3 points. Then Featherfall is okay, but you know, the free casting once per day is actually not that great for this kind of spell that I wouldn't expect to need on most adventuring days. I've assigned it 10 points. Then we have Levitate, which is one of the stronger 2nd level spells. Levitate is a solid spell, and this is exactly the kind of spell where I would have expected the designers to assign an, you can only cast this on yourself kind of limitation, but they didn't. so this gets a solid 25 points. So that's a total of 38 points for Mingle with the Wind, plus 15 for lightning resistance, 8 for Unending Breath, 10 for darkvision, and 20 for the 35 movement rate, and our total is 91 points. This puts Air Genasi at A tier and right near the top of A tier. If you aren't getting it, basically, if you want an optimal race, Monsters of the Multiverse is a fantastic resource. Speaking of fantastic, now let's talk about the Bugbear. So we start with darkvision. It's not flashy, but it's worth 10 points. Then Fey Ancestry, which I covered in the Player's Handbook tier rankings. It's advantage on saving throws versus charm effects, and it's worth 10 points. Then a pretty unique feature, Long-Limbed. This provides the Bugbear an additional 5 feet of reach on melee attacks, with what is, in my opinion, a ridiculous limitation of on their turn only. Which means if you make a reaction attack and it's not your turn, then I guess you're not long-limbed anymore? I don't get it. But nevertheless, this is a handy feature for your Bugbear, and I assigned it a 20-point score. Powerful build is pretty run-of-the-mill, and honestly, it's more of a ribbon. So I've assigned it 5 points, and I will for all races that get it. Sneaky combines 2 benefits. First, you get a free skill proficiency, which is worth 4 points on its own. And then the Bugbear can move through and stop in spaces large enough for a small creature. Again, this is a bit silly because it ignores that the Bugbear might not always be medium-sized. But it is a ribbon feature, so I gave it 3 points, so a total of 7 for Sneaky. Then we get a feature that made the Bugbear super popular after Monsters of the Multiverse. Go ahead and pick your source of optimized builds. They probably have a build centered around this feature. Most of the damage-adding features, such as the recently covered Celestial Revelation, have a once-on-your-turn limitation. If I was to hazard a guess why this feature doesn't have that limit, I would imagine it's because it's only active when attacking a creature that hasn't taken a turn in combat yet. But because of abilities or spells that allow several attacks, and then adding a potential action surge to do them again, surprise attack can add up to a boatload of additional damage right at the start of a combat. It is a powerful feature, and I assigned it 60 points. Add that to Sneaky for 7, Powerful Build for 5, Long-Limbed for 20, Fey Ancestry for 10, and darkvision for 10, and the Bugbear adds up to a whopping 112 points. And that lands them in S tier, right behind the Aasimar. Which is interesting, because this is one of those cases where my gut instincts would have put the Bugbear ahead of the Aasimar, but this is where the point totals landed. The next race is the Centaur. Now, I value speed bonuses quite highly, so the Centaur is the fastest race in the game with a whopping 40-foot movement speed, so I didn't play around with point values here. I assigned it 40 points. I suspect a lot of my viewers would assign it fewer, which, if you would, I'd totally get. But, in my evaluation, I think it's worth 40 points. Then we have Charge, and this basically provides a bonus action attack with your hooves as long as you move 30 feet towards an enemy before you attack it. Hoof attacks aren't great, but this isn't that difficult to set up, and I figured it's worth 20 points. Then we have Equine Build, which is actually a 2-edged sword. So you basically get Powerful Build, which, as we've already established, I assigned 5 points. But Equine Build also provides a penalty to climbing because those horse legs aren't well adapted for it. So I kind of consider Equine Build a wash. 5 points for Powerful Build, minus 5 points for the climb penalty, 0 points. Then we have Hoof Attack, and just like the Aarakocra Talons, this feature is worth 10 points. And then finally we get a free skill, which is worth 5 points because we can choose from multiple options. So we have 40 for speed, 20 for charge, 0 for Equine Build, 10 for hooves, and a free skill for 5, and our total is 75 points. So this is enough for the Centaur to sneak onto A tier, but it is a fair bit behind the Air Genasi. But this list so far is pretty stacked, as you can see. Next up is the Changeling. We begin with 2 free skills, and we can choose from a list, so that's 5 points each for a total of 10 points. Then we get to the hard one. So Shape Changer, I spent more time considering this feature and how much it's worth, probably more than any other feature in the game, because, what do I even compare this to? It's obviously a great feature, at least as far as the social pillar of the game goes, but it's not really relevant to the other 2 pillars. I ended up assigning it 50 points. Some of you might consider that low, others might consider it high, but whichever you think, I get it. The mileage is going to vary based on your table, but 50 is what I landed on. But when it comes to the total, the Changeling really does suffer on the tier ranking by only having 2 features. You get 50 for Shape Changer, 10 for Changeling Instincts, and that is 60 points total. And that puts them in C tier. I mean, at the higher end of C tier, but C tier. And I get that there are certain kinds of builds where Changeling is absolutely ideal. I mean, I'm playing a Changeling right now in an extended campaign, never felt like they were weak, but this is where it landed. Our next race is the Deep Gnome, or Svervneblin, I think that's it. We start with darkvision, which is normally worth 10 points, but Deep Gnomes get enhanced darkvision with a 120-foot range, so I bumped it up to 15. Then the gift of the Svervneblin, so they don't get a free cantrip, but they get Disguise Self at 3rd level and non-detection at 5th. Honestly, I would not consider these ideal options. Yeah, you can choose the casting ability and use spell slots, and both spells have occasional use, so I gave 20 points for the two combined. Then we have Gnomish Magic Resistance, and I need to talk a little bit about my video for the Player's Handbook, because I assigned 25 points to Gnomish Resistance for the Player's Handbook Gnomes, but it was pointed out to me in the comments that it probably deserved more points because it applied to all magic and not just spells. And that is a very fair point, and I probably did undervalue it. But here it is, restricted to just spells, so 25 should be correct for the Deep Gnome at least. Finally, Svervneblin Camouflage allows you to make stealth rolls with advantage a limited number of times. It's okay, but it's not amazing. I assigned it 10 points. So we add them together, and we have 15 for Enhanced Dark Vision, 20 for the spells, 25 for the Gnomish Magic Resistance, and 10 for the Stealth Advantage, and that adds up to 70 points, and that ends up putting the Deep Gnome in B tier. And as for giving a wrong value for the Gnomish Magic Resistance for Player's Handbook Gnomes, I will have to consider that, and I may adjust their ranking that I gave in the last video before I do my final wrap-up of these videos. But I haven't given it a lot of thought yet. Next up, we have the Duergar, or Grey Dwarf. Like the Deep Gnome, we have 120-foot dark vision, so like the Deep Gnome, that's worth 15 points. Then we have Duergar Magic. Enlarge, Reduce, and Invisibility are both solid spells. However, here we have a self-only limitation. And that is a big limitation, especially for Enlarge, Reduce. So Enlarge, Reduce becomes essentially a ribbon feature. I gave it 5 points. Then I gave 15 for the Invisibility, where I think the self-only limitation isn't as big a deal, for a total of 20 points for Duergar Magic. Then we have Dwarven Resistance, and we went over this already with Player's Handbook races, but the Poison Damage Resistance is worth 17, then add on 10 more for the advantage on the saving throws, and the feature total is 27 points. Then Psionic Fortitude, which is not resistance to psychic damage. Instead, the feature provides advantage on saving throws versus charmed effects, which is pretty good, and stunned effects, which I think is far more rare. I mean, I guess the idea of the Duergar is they're in the Underdark, and so they probably come up against Mind Flayer enclaves more commonly, and that Psychic Blast stuns, so they would come up there. But overall, if you're playing this as a player character, I'd consider the advantage to come up pretty rarely. But it does make this feature a bit more valuable than, say, Fey Ancestry, so I gave it 13 points. So we got 15 for Dark Vision, 20 for Duergar Magic, 27 for Dwarven Resilience, and 13 for Psionic Fortitude, and the Duergar adds up to 75 points. So I put it right here on the A tier, but it is tied with the Centaur, so they could be in either order. Next up is the Earth Genasi, and we begin with Dark Vision, that is a standard 10 points. Then we have Earthwalk. This allows the Earth Genasi to move across difficult terrain that's on the ground or a floor without expending additional movement. It's decent when it comes up, but I wouldn't think it would come up all that often in the standard campaign. I assigned it 8 points. And last but not least, we have Merge with Stone. First off, this gives us the Blade Ward cantrip, which I'd say is worth about 5 points, but we get a special rider on this one that we can cast it as a bonus action, number of times equal to our proficiency bonus per long rest. I think this makes it a lot better, so I'm actually going to add an additional 13 points for a total of 18 points for the Blade Ward cantrip with the bonus action casting. And then we get Pass Without Trace. This is a top tier level 2 spell, and I am giving that 35 points. So in total, Merge with Stone is actually going to give us 53 points. We have Dark Vision for 10, Earthwalk for 8, Merge with Stone for 53 gives us a total of 71 points. And that puts it right here at the top side of B tier. I mean, it's almost A tier. It's just ahead of the Deep Gnome. Our next race is the Eladrin. Dark Vision we know is 10 points. Fey Ancestry we know is 10 points. Then we have Phase Step. The bonus action teleport alone would be valued at 50 points. However, you get an additional benefit depending on your season, which, by the way, you can switch after a long rest. I figure the most valuable benefit is the Spring Season, which allows you to teleport a willing creature within 5 feet of you instead of yourself. I figure that adds 20 points to the feature for a total of 70 points. Then Keen Senses is a free skill, and that's worth 4 points. And Trance is normally worth 10 points, but the Eladrin Trance also provides 2 proficiencies in weapons or tools. Each are worth 1 point for a total of 12 points for Trance. And so we have Darkvision for 10, Fey Ancestry for 10, Phase Step for 70, Keen Senses for 4, and Trance for 12, and that is a total of 106. And so there it is on the S tier, though it is the lowest placing of our S tier races so far. Still, S tier is getting stacked. And then we get to the race that's going to have the highest score, and that is the Fairy. So we start with Fairy Magic, and we begin with the Druidcraft cantrip. Not a great cantrip, only gets 3 points. Then at 3rd level, we can cast the Fairy Fire spell. That's a lot better, and that is worth 15 points. And then we get the Enlarge Reduce spell at level 5, and unlike the Duergar, this one doesn't have that self-only limitation, so it's actually reasonably good for 17 points. So Fairy Magic in total is going to give us 35 points. Then we have Flight, and this is basically the same as the Aarakocra Flight, so it gets the same value, 100 points. So we have 35 from Fairy Magic, and we have 100 from Flight, and that is 135 points. And this is going to be the highest total that any race in the game is going to get. It tops the list on our video today, and it's going to top the list of all the races from all the source books. Fairies are really, really good. Now, I get it that if you look at this, it looks like I'm throwing everything under S tier, but when I ranked all the races in all the source books, this is going to be a fairly even spread from A to D. It's just that the races for Monsters of the Multiverse happen to be more powerful than most of the other races, though we will be filling out some lower rankings pretty quickly here. Our next race is the Firbolg, and we start with Firbolg Magic. 1 free Detect Magic, 1 free Disguise Self. You get these right at 1st level, which is nice, but these are so-so spells. Detect Magic, I only gave 5 points, because you know what? It's also a spell with the ritual tag. So in a lot of cases, getting to be able to cast it for free isn't much of anything. Disguise Self, I gave 15 points, which is a couple more points than I considered for the same spell for Deep Gnomes, since in this case you get it at 1st level. So in total, Firbolg Magic is worth 20 points. Then Hidden Step is pretty cool. You can turn invisible as a bonus action, proficiency bonus times per long rest. It has the standard limits where if you make attacks, you roll for damage, or you force a saving throw, it gets broken. And the duration isn't long, it lasts until your next turn. Still, this is a really strong defensive feature. Like, you can take your turn as normal, and as long as you don't use your bonus action, you can use it at the end of your turn to do Hidden Step, and then you have this really strong defense until your next turn. I gave this 35 points. This is probably the defining feature of the Firbolg. Then we have a couple ribbon features. Powerful Build, 5 points, and then Speech of Beast and Leaf, also very ribbon, 5 points. So Firbolg Magic is 20 points, Hidden Step 35, Powerful Build 5, and Speech of Beast and Leaf for 5. That's a total of 65 points. That is enough to squeak into B tier, but behind the Earth Genasi and Deep Gnome. Next up is the Fire Genasi, and this one has some issues. So we get Dark Vision, and that's worth 10 points. Then we have Fire Resistance, and that's good, and that's worth 17. But then we have Reach to the Blaze, and this one is a letdown. You do not get the solid Firebolt cantrip, instead the inferior Produce Flame cantrip. Then you get Burning Hands, which is also on the weaker side, but it's okay. Then Flame Blade at 5th level, and Flame Blade is awful. I almost considered 0 points for Flame Blade, but I figured that there's maybe some really rare circumstances where maybe you would use it. I gave 3 points to Produce Flame, 10 for Burning Hands, and 5 for Flame Blade. And Reach of the Blaze just ends up being a lot worse than these kinds of free spell features usually are, 18 points total. And so we have Dark Vision for 10, Fire Resistance for 17, and 18 for Reach for the Blaze, and that is a total of 45 points. And that leaves the Fire Genasi at our lowest rank of D, though it will rank ahead of a number of the Player's Handbook races. And next up, we're covering the Gith. That's, of course, 2 races. We'll start with the Githyanki. Astral Knowledge is easy. A flexible skill is worth 5, and a weapon or tool is worth 1, so that is a total of 6 points. Then we have Githyanki Psionics. You get the Mage Hand cantrip, the jump spell at 3rd level, and Misty Step at 5th. Mage Hand is fine, but not outstanding. It's worth 5 points. Then Jump isn't that good. I gave it 10 points, and that might have been generous. And then Misty Step is a great 2nd level spell, and I gave it 30 points, so we end up with a total of 45. Finally, we have Psychic Damage Resistance, and that is worth 14 points. So Astral Knowledge for 6, Githyanki Psionics for 45, and Psychic Resistance for 14, and our total is 65 points. This puts the Githyanki tied with the Firbolg. I just put it beside on the right. The other Gith is the Githzerai, which we'll go over next. Githzerai Psionics gives us Mage Hand, which is 5 points. Then the Shield spell at 3rd level, and this is huge. On an optimized build, this is basically going to save you a whole 1-level class dip a lot of the time. That puts it right at the top end for 1st level spells, so it is worth 30. And it would be worth a whole lot less if you couldn't use your spell slots to cast again, by the way. But if you're making like a cleric or a druid, this is a great feature. Then Detect Thoughts, which is a useful spell, not nearly as impactful as Shield, but I figure it's still worth 15. So that's 50 points for Githzerai Psionics altogether. Then we get Mental Discipline, which provides advantage to charm saving throws, like Fey Ancestry does, and that is worth 10. And it also gives us advantage on the Frightened condition, like Brave does, which is also worth 10. So we add them together, and that's 20 points. Finally, Psychic Resilience is 14 points for resistance to psychic damage. And we end up with 50 points for Githzerai Psionics, 20 for Mental Discipline, then 14 for Psychic Resilience, and that adds up to 84. And that puts the Githzerai at A tier, right between Genasi and Centaur. And we're getting close to the end of our rankings for this video as we move on to the Goblin. Now, I personally consider the Goblin to be an underrated race. It's really good, and let's go over why. So, darkvision, 10 points. Then Fey Ancestry, that's also 10 points. Then Fury of the Small. This provides a small damage boost a number of times per day. Now, I think this is often the first feature that comes to mind for players when they think about a Goblin, but it's really not that powerful. But you know what? It's not bad. I gave it 13 points. The big one that people sleep on is Nimble Escape. This gives the Goblin a bonus action disengage or hide and no usage limit. That is 2/3 of cunning action as a racial feature, and that is pretty strong. I gave Nimble Escape 65 points. So 10 from Darkvision, 10 from Fey Ancestry, 13 from Fury of the Small, and 65 for Nimble Escape, and that is 98 points. And that puts the Goblin at the low end of the S tier. And that brings us to the last race we're covering today, the Goliath. So we start with Little Giant, which is a free skill, and that's worth 4 points. And then it's combined with Powerful Build, and that's worth 5 points, so it is a total of 9 points. Then Mountain Born, which is Cold Resistance, worth 15 points. And then you get the ability to naturally acclimate to high altitudes, which is actually surprisingly useful, so I gave it 20 points. Not just kidding, 1 point. And I considered 0. But I gave it 1, so 16 total. Last but not least is Stone's Endurance. This one is pretty good. You can use your reaction to reduce damage taken by a d12 plus your Constitution modifier. This is amazing at 1st level, though although it scales in uses, it doesn't scale in amounts. I mean slightly if you raise your Constitution. I gave it 25 points. I think it's a decent feature, but not amazing. So Little Giant for 9, Mountain Born for 16, and Stone's Endurance for 25, and that gives us a total of 50. That is just enough to squeak into C tier, a fair bit behind the Changeling. So this is our final spread, basically the opposite of the Player's Handbook. Speaking of which, let's add in our Player's Handbook races. So here's our tier chart so far, including the Player's Handbook and the first half of Monsters of the Multiverse, and you can see it is a far more even spread. With Fairy at the top, Rock Gnome at the bottom, though again I am considering a change for Rock Gnome and Forest Gnome, because I have likely undervalued the Player's Handbook version of Gnomish Resistance, so those will probably end up higher. In a future video I'll discuss it when I come up with what the point values should have been. I'm going to pick up the rest of the Monsters of the Multiverse races in my next video, from Harengon to Yuan Ti. How close would your rankings be to this chart? Let's discuss it in the comments below. Otherwise, until next time, I am going to sit back, relax, and have some fun. D&D is for everyone. Thanks everybody, and I'll talk to you soon.